She walked alone, as she always did. Manhattan had learned not to stop for her. Passers-by glanced twice, then looked away, unsure whether the tall woman moving quietly along the park's edge was who they thought she was. She gave them nothing to confirm it, no acknowledgement. No eye contact, no slowing of her pace. 2 years earlier, Greta Garbo had been the highest-paid actress in Hollywood. Her face had filled screens across 4 continents. Studios competed for her. Directors called her a phenomenon they could not explain. Then, at the precise moment her value was beyond question, she walked away from a $250,000 contract and never made another film. No announcement, no farewell picture. No explanation offered to the millions who had made her the most famous woman alive. The question that followed her was one no one ever answered. Was it really her choice, or was she pushed? MGM did not discover Greta Garbo so much as they engineered her. When the young Swedish actress arrived in Hollywood in 1925, the studio's head of production, Irving Thalberg, recognized something in her that resisted simple categorization. She was not a vamp. She was not a girl next door. She was not anything the American film industry had encountered before. Thalberg built a formula around that strangeness rather than trying to sand it away. The formula was precise and, for a time, nearly perfect. In every film, Garbo would be a woman of ageless mystery, encountered by an idealistic man who inevitably discovered she was beyond his reach. She suffered. She sacrificed. She loved with a completeness that ultimately destroyed her. And she did it wearing gowns that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, in settings that felt like fever dreams of European sophistication. Audiences responded with something beyond ordinary admiration. They responded with devotion. Her 1,930 film, Anna Christie, marketed under the tagline Garbo Talks, drew crowds who had never particularly cared about motion pictures before. Her voice, low and accented and utterly distinctive, only deepened the obsession. By the mid-1930s, she had become less a film star than a living mythology. Directors spoke about her the way scholars speak about phenomena they can measure but cannot fully explain. But mythologies require maintenance. By 1937, the formula Thalberg had so carefully constructed had finally run its course. Her film, Conquest, lost money. The grand love affairs felt too familiar. The suffering had grown predictable. And in May of 1938, theater owners across the country published a declaration that landed in Hollywood like a lit match. Garbo's name appeared on a list of stars they considered box office poison. The goddess, it turned out, had developed cracks. MGM understood they had a problem. They also understood they were not ready to let her go. What they needed was not a replacement for Greta Garbo, but a reinvention of her. Something that would make audiences remember why they had loved her, without reminding them of everything they had seen before. The solution arrived in the form of a comedy. A Soviet bureaucrat dispatched to Paris a script written by Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett, a director named Ernst Lubitsch, whose instinct for wit and elegance had earned him a reputation that existed entirely outside the studio machinery that produced everyone else. The marketing team reduced the gamble to 2 words: Garbo laughs. It worked because it was honest. Ninotchka did not pretend the old Garbo had never existed. It acknowledged her directly, folding her mythology into the comedy itself. The severity that had made her untouchable became the source of the humor. When her character finally broke into laughter, audiences felt something genuine shift. Not because Garbo had become someone new, but because she had revealed a dimension of herself that the previous decade of suffering had kept carefully hidden. The warmth was always there. Lubitsch simply found the door. Critics responded with something approaching disbelief. The public returned in numbers MGM had not seen from her in years. The film earned over $2 million at a moment when the studio had quietly begun calculating whether she was still worth the risk. She earned an Academy Award nomination. Gossip columns declared the laughing Garbo 10 times more compelling than the somber one. The studio drew exactly one conclusion from all of this: Garbo could do comedy. What they failed to understand was the more important lesson. Ninochka had worked not because of the comedy, but because of Lubitsch. That distinction would cost everyone dearly. The follow-up came together the way disasters usually do. Quickly, cheaply, and with the confidence of people who had recently been right about something, Two-Faced Woman was assigned to director George Cukor, whose talents were genuine but whose sensibility ran toward verbal sparring and deep characterization. The screenplay leaned in the opposite direction, toward physical comedy and mistaken identity farce, the kind of broad, mechanical humor that had nothing to do with what made Garbo compelling. The budget was cut. The shooting schedule was compressed. When scenes required rethinking, there was no time to rethink them. Cukor later admitted they all knew during production that something was wrong. The feeling on set, he said, had the quality of a portent. Then the Legion of Decency arrived. The Catholic organization condemned Two-Faced Woman as an affront to Christian values, citing its attitude toward marriage and what they described as suggestive situations. The film was banned in several cities. A congressman wrote to the head of the production code demanding its distribution be halted, calling it vile. MGM, in a panic, recalled the original cut and inserted a clarifying scene. What reached most audiences was a compromised version of a film that had already been compromised during its creation. The reviews were merciless. Critics went out of their way to exempt Garbo from their contempt, while making clear she had been placed in an impossible position. One writer described watching her dance as almost as shocking as seeing your mother drunk. Another called it vandalism. The word that appeared most frequently, in one form or another, was uncomfortable. The box office damage was modest. Audiences still showed up, but something more fragile than ticket sales had been broken. MGM had spent 15 years constructing the illusion that Greta Garbo existed on a plane slightly above ordinary human experience. Two-Faced Woman dismantled that illusion in 94 minutes. She had been made ordinary. There was no formula for recovering from that. The failure of Two-Faced Woman did not end Greta Garbo's career. 4 other things did, arriving simultaneously, each one quietly closing a door she might otherwise have walked back through. Irving Thalberg had died in 1937. The man who understood her, who had shaped her films around her specific gravity rather than bending her toward the studio's preferences, was gone. In his place stood Louis B. Mayer, whose vision for MGM ran towards sentimental Americana, wholesome and digestible, and entirely incompatible with everything Garbo represented. Staying would have meant becoming something unrecognizable. The censorship that had descended on Two-Faced Woman signaled a new reality. Throughout the Depression era, her films had moved largely untouched through the machinery of moral oversight. That immunity had evaporated. The world her characters inhabited, European, morally complicated, erotically charged, was no longer something the industry would protect. Then, the war came. Pearl Harbor fell while the controversy over Two-Faced Woman was still generating headlines. The European audience that had sustained her mythology, that had understood instinctively what she represented, disappeared overnight. 2/3 of her world was simply gone, and she was 36. MGM's attention had already shifted toward a younger generation. Hedy Lamarr, Lana Turner. The studio that had built her was quietly building her replacements. She and MGM terminated her contract by mutual agreement in 1941. She told people she intended to return. For years, she remained open to the right project. But the right project never materialized, and the longer the silence extended, the heavier the expectation became. At some point, the weight of a potential return exceeded any imaginable reward. The silence became permanent. Not with a decision, exactly. More like a door that no one ever got around to opening again. She kept walking. That was what people remembered who spotted her in later years. Not that she stopped, not that she acknowledged anyone. She simply kept moving, as if stillness itself had become the thing she was most determined to avoid. What MGM never understood, what perhaps no studio system is capable of understanding, is that Garbo's power had never resided in her films. It resided in the distance between her and the audience, in what they could not have, in what she declined to explain. The moment she was made ordinary, she became replaceable. And ordinary was precisely what Two-Faced Woman had asked her to be. She had spent 15 years teaching audiences to want her. In the end, the most perfectly calibrated performance of her career was not on any screen. It was the silence afterward. Absolute, deliberate, and never broken. The mystery preserved exactly because she refused to solve it.